Over the past year and a half, I've put together a set of 4 vintage Zeiss lenses, 3 of them being Contax Zeiss, and 1 of them was a Zeiss Flexagon, and they were both incredible to work with and a huge pain in the neck. In today's video, I want to share my experience and thoughts on using vintage stills lenses for video production and explain why I ultimately ended up deciding to sell my set. For context, I primarily shoot documentaries, but I do end up shooting a lot of other video content. And so I wanted something that was relatively affordable, but could probably punch above its weight class in terms of image quality and price. And so that's why I was partially leaning towards vintage lenses, because I was seeing a lot of really good deals online and had seen a lot of YouTube videos about just how easy these things were to adapt to mirrorless camera bodies. And so I got really excited. I picked up a 20mm Zeiss Flexagon, picked up a 25mm Contax Zeiss, 50mm f1.4, and a 100mm f2. And when it came to image quality, for the most part, these lenses didn't disappoint. They did just about everything I wanted. They had a good amount of character, but they didn't fall apart in most scenarios. They had good color, they were sharp, they were interesting, and I think that they kind of set themselves apart from, most modern mirrorless prime lenses out there. They don't have built-in lens corrections, and so you don't have the camera sort of standardizing or like washing out any of the character that's built into the lenses. And so I had like a pretty fantastic experience with the images that I was getting. Like, I absolutely loved them for the projects that I brought them on. But they were a huge pain in my neck because of the reliability issues that I kept running into. The 50mm f1.4 was almost unusable to me wide open at 1.4. The highlights would bloom like crazy, and there's even a little bit of this present at f2. In addition to this lens had some issues with oil buildup on the aperture blades. The Zeiss Flexagon 20mm lens also just flat out broke on me. The aperture blades were getting stuck, and I was able to take it apart and inspect everything, and I think I had fixed the issue for the most part. But when I put the lens back together and I was tightening everything down, all the screws down, one of the screws that connects to the aperture blades snapped off, and now the aperture blades are just completely stuck wide open. It's partly user error, but it also just is a kind of natural consequence of working with a really old product and like a really brittle screw. And so that lens I had to sell for parts. The other thing that plays a factor into this is just the fact that kind of finding and testing these lenses can be a little bit of a long and tedious process. Now, I think if that part really excites you, if, testing multiple copies of the same lens, hunting them down at different, used camera shops, researching serial numbers and characteristics of, different batches of these lenses is something that gets you excited, then I think you can find a good amount of enjoyment in just the process of collecting and acquiring these lenses. But for me, that part was just not something that I enjoyed as much as I thought I would. Initially, I liked kind of researching and finding these lenses, but when the reliability stuff started to kick in, it just wasn't worth it. The other thing to keep in mind, and is just kind of something that I discovered along the way, is that more and more kind of the budget manual cinema lenses, both spherical and anamorphic, have some really fantastic options with a lot of character that are not going to break the bank. And the last thing that I'll say is that as a guy that is mostly shooting documentary stuff, zoom lenses get used 80 to 90% of the time for me in my case. So owning a set of prime lenses is something that is a little bit more of a niche use case, and is something that gets used more often for YouTube and kind of personal projects. And so kind of owning that set and having that money tied up in that set was just not really worth it for me. If you enter into the world of vintage lenses a little bit like a collector, someone who likes to build and admire a classic car, but isn't necessarily going to trust it to drive it every single day, then I think you might be thrilled with vintage lenses. But if you need something that you can count on and that's going to be reliable every single time, and you don't mind driving that thing on the highway every single day, you don't necessarily freak out every time it gets a little scratch or a ding, or a family member has to take the car and borrow it. While this scenario might not be like a perfect example, I think it kind of illustrates what I'm getting at. I think that for the type of work that I'm doing, it just is not something that I can trust and want to put it through kind of that strain or stress. And so for me, right now, the world of vintage lenses is not for me, but that doesn't mean that it's not for you. I don't think this is a right or wrong thing. It just is something that I wanted to add to the conversation. I think vintage lenses and contact Zeiss gets so much hype on YouTube, and for good reason, but I wanted to add just a little bit of the other side of that coin. That while the images are fantastic, and I've loved the images that I've been able to capture on these lenses, you potentially could run into some pain points, and I definitely did, and it wasn't worth it for me. So I ended up selling those lenses and putting that money towards some tools that I'm gonna be using a lot more frequently. All right, that's gonna do it for this one. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.